Hi there, I'm Patrick McHugh with the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, a project of the North Carolina Justice Center where we believe in building a world where everyone, Black, brown, and white, can live economically secure and dignified lives. I sat down recently with Bryant Simon, who teaches history at Temple University. When Bryant was a graduate student at the University of North Carolina, one of the worst workplace disasters in recent North Carolina memory happened in the small town of Hamlet, when the Imperial Foods chicken processing plant went up in flames, taking the lives of 25 workers who were locked inside. Bryant spent years trying to understand how the Hamlet fire happened and what it reveals about what he calls a system of cheap, a political and economic system that puts workers' lives in peril, even in normal times, and becomes even more deadly during times of crisis like COVID-19. In trying to understand what's happening these days, we sat down towards the end of 2020 to talk about what we can learn from the Hamlet fire, how policy choices have shaped reality during COVID-19, and what we can do to truly value working people's lives going forward. Please join us.
The Hamlet fire is really about a kind of awful bargain in American life, about how some people have to risk their lives just to make a living, and it's not even a living, and how those people so often live in the shadows, and that's not by accident, right? In many ways, profit is derived by hiding things. So with that, just kind of thinking about that, because I think that can bring us back to COVID in a really kind of effective way. The story of the Hamlet fire, or at least the immediate story of the Hamlet fire, is the day after Labor Day on September 3rd, 1991, in a factory in Hamlet, which is a small town of about 5,000 people on the North Carolina, South Carolina border, about 2 hours east of Charlotte and 2 hours south of Raleigh. A small factory that made chicken tenders for places like Shoney's, Long John Silver's, and Red Lobster blew up. And why it blew up is, really about a kind of broader change in American life that I explore in the book I wrote about it. But the kind of immediate thing that happened was, and I think it's revealing of like the larger problem, is there was a problem in the factory, a hydraulic line that wasn't working the right way, the most mundane and ordinary problem that happens in a factory. And so the repair people went to fix it, and they didn't have the right part because the right part was too far away and too expensive and would have shut down the line for too long, leaving workers standing there not sort of generating product and profit for the owner. And so they fixed the hydraulic line with what they had, which were the wrong parts. Had done it before. No one thought too much of it. They attached the hydraulic line, they turned it back on, and it became uncoupled. It spewed highly flammable liquid all over the place, including, again, mundane stuff, right? Under the towards the burners that were lighting a huge fryer that cooked the chicken tenders. Those burners weren't covered. They should have been by any kind of fire safety regulation, but they weren't. Nobody cared, right? And so what happened was it just created this explosion, basically. And then that's what it was. It was an explosion that blew a hole in the roof of this little one-story factory. And the workers who were in front of the plant, they were able to escape out the front. But the workers who worked in the back, they ran to the back exits. They didn't really know where to go because the plant had never had a fire safety drill. And they ran to doors that were locked. They were locked in some cases from the outside, double bolted in one case. One door, which was an exit door, only opened to the inside. So workers tried to sort of smash it down, and they didn't know that it opened the wrong way, which was, again, a fire safety violation. And some workers, again, trapped at those locked doors, tried to find safety and refuge in a cooler. thinking that the cooler where the frozen chicken tenders would save them from the flames. In a kind of brutal irony, that was a door that didn't work. And poisonous carbon monoxide gases leaked into that cooler and killed 12 people there. By the time the fire was over, and again, this was, it was preventable in almost every way imaginable. Not the fire itself, which we can talk about, but the aftermath of it. 25 people were dead. I quickly learned some of the kind of awful detail, even more, kind of background details of the fire. And that is that the owners of the plant were from Pennsylvania, a father and son team by the name of Emmett and Brad Rowe. And in Pennsylvania, in the early 1980s, they were facing a challenge from a union and actually a well-funded state and federal health and safety organization. And they didn't really want anyone telling them how they would run their plant. And eventually they would see an ad for a shuttered ice cream factory in Hamlet, North Carolina. And they would read, they weren't really recruited, but they didn't need to be. They just needed to read the town brochure and the state's brochure to tell them in very not so subtle language that they wouldn't have to deal with much fire safety kind of regulation in a place like North Carolina. And they did due diligence and found out that there was high rates of unemployment in Richmond County. So they would have a kind of pool of cheap labor that they wanted. And so they relocated their plant. I knew that from the News and Observer. I knew that a kind of amazing fact from the News and Observer that in 1991, North Carolina was actually per capita the most industrialized state in the country. It was also the least unionized state in the country. And it had a really eroded state OSHA outfit. And so that at the point that the fire happened, if the 30 or 40 OSHA inspectors for the state of North Carolina inspected one factory a day, every day, 5 days a week, it would have taken them almost 70 years to reach every plant in the state. That effectively meant, right, there was no kind of regulation. I also knew from reading the paper that the plant had had 3 previous fires. I would learn later that the local fire chief had never stepped foot in the plant despite that fact. And so, I knew enough about like the fact that this was a kind of a tragedy that had to do with a kind of systematic neglect, right? But the real moment when I began to think about things in a different way was I sort of decided I was going to look into the fire. And so I took a trip to Hamlet. I reached out to a few people, and that included 3 kind of local journalists who had covered the fire. And they agreed to meet me for lunch at a diner. It wasn't even in Hamlet because Hamlet really couldn't sustain a diner by that point. And we were talking about it, and I thought, like, one of the things that really just stuck out at me, and I write about this in the beginning of the book, is at one point they looked at me and said, look, there's not a story here. This is really just about a rogue employer and an accident. And one of them, I think it sussed me out and said, look, there's no deeper social meaning here. And in some ways, I kind of wrote the book as a gentle response to that. And what I would suggest is that system was created by politics, by choice, by deliberate actions, not to blow up a plant in Hamlet, but to make the people who work there vulnerable and unseen. And really what happened, right, at the plant that day was exposing that system, right? Exposing its fragility, exposing its meanness, and exposing its cruelty to a certain group of people. But there was no accident about any of that, right? That was the system. And I call the system in my book cheap. And it's the idea, right, that the way you create progress is by making everything cost less, and making government cost less, making labor cost less, and making food cost less. And then in that, right, you can create some sort of fairness and equity, right? I mean, but it's a lie, right? And it's based on a lie, right? Like the whole system is based on a lie, because the only people who benefit from cheap, and the Rows actually didn't even really benefit from cheap, right? They were caught in the system to a certain extent. Was, you know, a kind of larger kind of actors, I would say, but this was a small kind of version of a story of cheap that I think we're still sort of combating and dealing with, and that extends from work to the choices of what people eat, to the way they're regarded in their community, to even if they're going to be seen.
I think unfortunately we're seeing cheap all over the place during COVID-19. It's sort of like, you know, there's a Hamlet fire happening in every community across this country, in a way that, as you say, you know, reveals a system that was built on purpose to serve a very small number of folks.
Yeah.
And to leave most everybody else. I think you're absolutely, and it's interesting for you to point out, you know, even the folks that own the plant, that were sort of in some level the most directly responsible for not covering the burner, for allowing, you know, a cut rate fixed job on their hydraulic system, for not running a basic fire safety protocol, you know, all of those things. You know, they were probably, I mean, they're in a commodity market. I'm sure they were operating on narrow margins, and competing on, you know, with other competitors. If they, you know, paid their employees a little bit more, they would have been, you know, lost those contracts. So, yeah, they were doing, you know, they weren't the ones in the factory, but they were also, you know, part of this same system that ultimately was responsible for those deaths of those folks.
Yeah, I actually think it's a really important point. I mean, they're kind of not like they played the part of bad guys. I mean, at one point, it was kind of a famous picture. Emmett Rowe was the father of the father and son team, and a reporter dogs him, you know, just to ask him some. I mean, he's dogging him, but ask him basic questions, and Rowe gives him the finger. I mean, he was not, you know, a sympathetic figure, but he was in the same way trapped in this system of cheap. The logic of this system meant that in order to stay afloat, he just had to cut costs. And the town itself, which it's interesting to know about Hamlet. Hamlet had been a railroad center. It was actually a place of really high wage jobs. They were union jobs, in fact. And you know, I sort of argue in the book, like the parallel to Hamlet is more Detroit than it is like a small mill town in the South. But that industrial base is eroding by the 80s. And the town is desperate for tax revenues, right? And so for Rowe, right, the whole thing was to go to some place where he could do whatever he wanted. Because that's the only way he could stay afloat, right? Because everybody else was doing whatever they wanted, right? They were equally kind of, and so he couldn't afford, or felt like he couldn't afford, and then probably couldn't have, right? If everybody else is not abiding by kind of workplace safety regulations by the books, how do you compete if those regulations aren't enforced? If everybody else is, you know, trying to get as much as they can out of product, including using tainted meat at times, right? You can't afford to throw away that. You're just throwing away the potential. You know, you can hide it with salt, which has a kind of impact on the people who eat it, but you know, you can't afford to do that, right? Else you're going to, and for him, right, this was a family owned business. It was not, you know, capital, you know, was not traded on any exchange. He had people, I mean, he wasn't the nicest guy, but by all accounts, he really loved his family, right? And their livelihood was at stake in this thing. And so I think you're right. I mean, when a system takes place, right, lots of people get trapped in the logic of it.
We
And
see that all over the place. Anytime you start talking about a minimum wage law, the first folks that they're going to start pointing to and trot out there are going to be some small business owner who I'm sure, many of them legitimately are like, I don't know how to pay my folks $15 an hour. I'll go out of business. Well, you're trapped in a system just like the folks that work for you that
but part of
force
that
you
system, I think, is
to make those kinds of choices.
But at the heart of that system, and the heart of the story I'm telling here, is the lie about the price.
Right.
So
Right.
the Hamlet's, the manufacturers, the Imperial Food Products is the name of the company. They made chicken tenders that sold at Shoney's, drinking fries included, for $1.99 in 1991. But that price is a lie, right? That we've come to believe that, and that lie is based upon all the outsourcing of the costs, right? And so part of it is we need more honest pricing, right? Like we need to say, well, they have all these bargains that they get from chicken manufacturers illegally dumping excrement and urine into waterways in North Carolina. We need to say, right, that they have a price that doesn't reflect on the fact that in order to make chicken that cheap, workers who were involved in the disassembly of chickens destroy their bodies. Their hands, their feet, right, are destroyed by this process, and they are forced to go on public assistance. That's a cost we don't account for, right? In order to make, chicken like this, we need to subsidize corn in order to make the batter cheap enough, in order to make the corn syrup cheap enough for the dipping sauces, right? And so we've come to believe, right, that if we charge if people make $15 an hour, somehow that's going to be the one factor of production that immediately is reflected in the price, right? And because we don't have a very honest accounting of price in this country, which is deliberate. It's on purpose, right?
What would it look like to have a system where it's not left up to individual employers to do right by their employees and to figure out how to survive economically while doing right by their employees?
What it would look like is a fundamental rethinking of the place of work and the place of safety in American society. It would essentially be an overthrow of the system of cheap, including with the fantasy at the kind of core of cheap about individualism. It would mean caring about people. It would mean valuing their lives. And so COVID is interesting in that sense because two things, lots of things happen, but two things I think happen when it comes to labor. And it's a little bit similar to Florence, right? There are moments when, because cheap relies on the repression of and the hiding of both information and costs. And Florence, for instance, made clear the costs in terms of environmental costs of Eastern North Carolina's dependence on factories that disassemble animals. As those factories, the water swelled and they became overwhelmed with high fecal counts and urine and nitrates, right? So now what happened with that is the next question, right? And very little follow through. And that's kind of interesting, right? But if you think about what COVID did at one level, it did all the things that sort of happened. And we've been talking about this at the Hamlet plant. It made workers risk their lives to work. It put them in places in which they had to calculate between their children and their own personal safety. Do I miss a day of work in a dangerous factory? No, I can't, because I'm responsible for my family. And we all know this, right? We read about it. We talked to people. We heard their voices. They were making those decisions every day. And many of them got incredibly sick. Some people died, right? Some people found themselves in a kind of new form of economic precarity because they chose their lives over dangerous work. That's a familiar story and a tragic story, and we can talk about how to solve that. But something else happened that I think is interesting. We saw them, and it was one of these moments, right, that don't happen very much anymore. Because one of the things we were talking about, the kind of older social bargain, workers were also at the center of the American imagining. A GM ad would regularly have somebody in work clothes and a lunch pail. That attire, that style, if you're old enough, is really familiar. It, it, Politicians celebrated the working class, not the vague middle class, right? I mean, workers, we saw working people, and I think that's also part of why that moment was different. And so the question to me about COVID is, how do we keep those workers in sight? How do we keep their lives, their vulnerability, their connection to us in sight? And what would this require of us? Does this require a different kind of labor movement? Does it require a different kind of politics? How long do we have while they're in sight before they fade back again into sort of and don't represent a group that suffers from similar kinds of oppression and exploitation, but yet again, a group of individuals who've maybe failed in our kind of meritocracy society? Like, how do we hold them in light and sort of take their vulnerability, which we all identified with, and act on it?